For Holt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm sure the member for Bruce will go and reflect on the standing orders. And in fact, I wasn't going to speak on this particular matter, but the member for Bruce inspired me with his inspiring rhetoric and passion for the subject. And I too wanted to speak about the Treasury Laws Amendment Enterprise Tax Plan number 2 bill. I think you've obviously heard, Deputy Speaker, that on this side there have been a lot of concerns raised about what net benefit that our economy is going to get if this $65 billion tax cut went through. And I've heard a lot in terms of the observations that not terribly much from our perspective, and a spirit of bipartisanship here. And that does how that really was driven home to me, and I would categorise myself as someone that is pro-business within the Labor Party and someone who has worked with businesses in a whole range of areas in my previous life. And if I thought this was a good idea, and if I thought this would actually generate the prosperity that this government says that it was going to generate, then I think not just me but others on our side would support this proposed tax cut. But that's not what I see, Deputy Speaker. Not what I see at all. And I do deal with business people a lot. And for the parliamentary record, when I was parliamentary secretary to Kevin Rudd, particularly during the global financial crisis, the one that is often denigrated on the other side, the one that we say that it wasn't as bad as people were going to be talking about, we did work very closely with business. And it's important to lay the groundwork for why I say that it could be better, this $65 billion could be better spent and could be backed up with appropriate sort of savings. So what used to happen is that, particularly early on, if I can go back in history, and it does tie into this enterprise tax plan, we started detecting softening in the US economy, and a substantial softening, and particularly when we saw the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And I'm glad I'm able actually to talk about this because it's one of the great failings of the Rudd-Gillard era, Rudd-Gillard-Rudd, that they were never actually able to get a proper description about what we were facing during the global financial crisis due to the internal dynamics that were happening. And I was going to hope that your side of politics, Mr Deputy Speaker, had learned from us, but I think you took the wrong lessons from us, and I think you're now reaping the dividend of that cancer in terms of the way in which you deal with unpopular leaders or you have difficulties with leaders. And that's not an attack on you, it's just an observation. But what it does do when you get consumed by the discussion about internal dynamics is your government doesn't get the message out about what it wants to achieve, what it has achieved for the economy. So during that period of time, particularly with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, businesses generally were facing diabolically bad conditions. And they weren't talking about tax cuts then, I can tell you. We faced two difficulties, Deputy Speaker, and I can recall being party to a number of very serious conversations about the economic difficulties that we faced. The first one, in terms of stabilising the world financial order, was that, in the words of when I spoke to Lindsay Tanner, who was then our finance minister, the world had a financial heart attack on 3 occasions. And in effect, the entire world financial system was close to collapse. And Australians don't realise that. Australians don't realise a lot of businesses were going to basically hit the wall. We had the most grave consequences in terms of what might have happened since the Great Recession. That's how bad it was. And it's interesting when we have this discussion now about this particular bill and the $65 billion tax cut to reflect on what actually occurred then. And that informs Labor's view, I think, a lot in terms of how best to support business productively so that it can grow in a market, I think, which is still affected by the vestiges of the global financial crisis. I think a lot of economic commentators, when they spoke about the global financial crisis and how Australia came out of it, I always detected an underlying fragility. I think it's still there. I think it affects big business and small business. But my point is, Deputy Speaker, we basically faced a situation where the global financial order was going to collapse. And what stopped it collapsing in Australia was the bank guarantee. I remember I meet with business. I deal with businesses. I deal with businesses across the area, and I'll touch on that in a second and tie this into this particular bill. But what I remember discussing was on the weekend that the special committee formed by the Prime Minister, I think it was the SPBC, the Strategic Budget Priorities Committee. There was a lot of criticism of that, but we were facing a situation where at the end of that particular week in October, the following week, if the Australian government hadn't taken action, there was going to be a run on the banks. Now, why do I talk about business, Deputy Speaker? I talk about business because of this. I sat down with a gentleman that had developed a lot of property around Dandenong and around the area, someone that was not necessarily pro-Labor, but someone that I would speak to from time to time. And he said this, as we were sitting there having breakfast on the weekend that the SPBC was meeting. He said, if you don't provide a bank guarantee for my business, I'm taking $16 million out of the bank next week. And I thought, that's bluster. And I said, that you can't be serious. And he said, my savings aren't safe. I'm taking the money out of the bank. He was a liquid business person, a successful business person, not a spendthrift, a successful business person. And so what we did, and I thought, this is getting very serious. And then if you remember what Ken Henry said as well, when we talked about this period of time, he was talking about his mother basically wanting to take money out of the bank. People underestimate what it was like for businesses at that period of time. I dealt with Jerry Ryan, who's the head of JACO, at the same period of time. And we would convene meetings with businesses, large businesses in the Dandenong area. These weren't publicised. They were important meetings that were put together with major retail chains, with major manufacturers that formed the bulk of employment in the Dandenong region. And this was slightly out of my area. And I would ask, what can we do to protect your businesses? And this is around the same period of late 28 to 2009. And Jerry started convening these meetings so I could talk with big businesses and small businesses directly. We've got to have stimulus in the economy. We've got to have stimulus in the economy, otherwise we're going to start laying off thousands and thousands of workers. Thousands of workers. And funnily enough, and I think the thing for critics of the then government's stimulus package, again relates to this particular bill because it's what does business need to create jobs and opportunity. When I hark back to that period of time, spend on infrastructure and create confidence in the community. Otherwise, major retail chains, and I won't go into it because these were meetings that were held with, I'd say, up to 14 or 15, and my staff member was there at that period of time. We were literally, Deputy Speaker, facing this yawning chasm of, my God, employment's going to collapse in the southeastern region of Melbourne. It was that close. And the worrisome thing when I look at this particular bill and we're talking about the $65 billion, everyone's forgotten just what Australian businesses were facing and what Australian government needed to do to keep those businesses afloat. So the first component was stop the run on the banks. And that's what happened with the stimulus, with the bank guarantee. And I noticed Treasurer Wayne Swan was speaking here yesterday, about BHP and its role. And I think the Treasurer was obviously right at the coalface in terms of what happened there. And he was talking about businesses that won't and don't pay tax, and I'll talk about that slightly later. But people forget that that's what we needed to do, to create confidence. And then the second measure, regardless of what side of politics, was injecting liquidity into the system. This is what we did with the first stimulus package, November, December that year. It lifted retail. Retail's a canary in the coal mine, Deputy Speaker. If retail's doing well, it's a canary, it's a good canary. If it's not doing so well, and retailers and major ones were telling me, we're sacking, we're getting ready for that Christmas period in 2008 to sack thousands of workers. That didn't happen. That was, I think, a government working constructively with business and big business. And then we, of course, established the infrastructure projects. And again, we would have differences about how that money was spent. When I looked at the number of tradespeople in my constituency whose jobs were saved by those stimulus packages that built those buildings that the opposition and now government were criticising, I was seeing a person, a livelihood, a lifestyle potentially taken away. And I would say, so my point is, when I look at what the government's putting forward, I see a measure that is not going to deliver the economic benefits that the government wants at a substantial cost to the economy and to its own reputation, really. And so I would respectfully, as I went back in history, there are better ways of doing this. When I talk to businesses now, Deputy Speaker, what they're not saying is don't give us a tax cut, they're saying build more infrastructure. Every person, they are Liberal supporters, coalition supporters. They talk like, I wouldn't go so far to say as they were talking like socialists, but when you're talking about people that I'd regard as being in the far right of the Liberal Party, and they're saying to me, I want you guys in the state government or there to concentrate on infrastructure, not one person's mentioned a tax cut to me. And we're proposing $65 billion worth of tax cuts, and these are big businesses. They don't talk also about, like Jayco, for example. Jerry Ryan hasn't come up to me and said, I would like, and they employ 800 people. They are a world-leading manufacturer of a great product, and also Jerry has another wing which features in Hollywood, which is the dinosaur creatures. I think it's about a $130 million enterprise. This is a man that does business overseas. These are one of the people that your government is targeting with this tax cut, but he's not saying we need this. So again, when I look at the rationale for why we need this, it's just not evident. I accept that the government has put forward its reason, but we've heard speaker after speaker on our side debunk that. Deputy Speaker, we're not opposing this because we just like opposing it. We're opposing it because we think the $65 billion, if it needed to be spent, could be spent in much more effective ways. As an example, I have 2 headspaces in my regional area. They happened as a consequence of lobbying that we did, my office did, and a group of incredible young students did in 2012, because we had a suicide cluster. Now, if anyone has lived in a region where you see young people killing themselves in the numbers that they did in my constituency, it's nothing. You don't want your worst enemy to live through that, Deputy Speaker. I can assure you that. What we did was that we lobbied the then government, and there was resistance from our side, so I'm not saying that this was an easy thing. And we did a program with 4 corners called No 3G in Heaven. And what the then Gillard government did was directed, I think, up to about $6 million, $3 million for the headspace in Dandenong, $3 million for the headspace in Narre Warren. And at least we did something with that. I went back to that Headspace, Deputy Speaker, again last week as part of National Mental Health Week and National Headspace Day. And you meet with the young people, you hear about the lives that are being saved, and as I was saying to you, particularly when you've been through an area that's been as scarred as that region was with the young people that had been killing themselves in that area, and what do they need? And so you talk with them afterwards and they go, we need funding certainty. Because beyond 2019, we're not quite sure if we can still function. And for someone who's lived through that experience of young people hurting themselves in this way, and we have massive population growth down our way, the fact that there's not a guarantee of the funding for an essential service that protects and saves young people just blows my mind. If I saw something in this bill that basically said, well, we're going to put $120 million to National Headspace, I'd say, congratulations, Deputy Speaker, your side of politics, or the gentleman sitting over there. I like that bit, but there's nothing there. There are tax cuts to businesses that in effect sometimes pay no tax. I have here in my hand an article from ABC News. It says, who pays what? The ATO names large companies that paid zero tax in 2014-15. Now, if I started reading this, there are 670 large companies that paid no corporate tax in the 2014-2015 financial year. 1,900 public, private and foreign-owned entities for the 2014-2015 year. They pay no tax. No tax. I could spend a couple of hours reading through this, leading these figures when you've got a company, an income of $216 million, no tax payable. That's just quite extraordinary, Deputy Speaker. So my view is, we can't support this particular tax cut. There are better ways of doing this. I respectfully put it to you and to the government that they reconsider this bill.